Rebecca Martinez stood at her mother's kitchen window, watching the November rain trace patterns down the glass. The familiar scent of burned coffee lingered in the air. Her mother Ellen hadn't made a proper cup in weeks. The house felt different now, heavy with unspoken words and lingering glances. "Mom, the bank called again," Rebecca said, turning to face Ellen, who sat at the kitchen table clutching a cold cup of coffee. "They mentioned something about missed payments." Ellen's hands tightened around the mug, her knuckles whitening. "It's nothing to worry about, sweetheart. Just a misunderstanding." But Rebecca had seen the stack of unopened envelopes in the drawer, caught glimpses of her mother's tear-stained face in the darkness of late nights. As a second-year law student, she'd learned to read between the lines, to spot the subtle tells that betrayed a person's true state of mind. "They said we're 3 months behind on the mortgage," Rebecca pressed gently. "And there were other debts mentioned. How much do we owe?" Ellen rose abruptly, the chair scraping against the linoleum. "I told you, I'm handling it." Her voice carried an edge Rebecca had never heard before. "Focus on your studies. That scholarship of yours is everything we worked for." Rebecca watched as her mother dumped the cold coffee in the sink, her movements sharp and agitated. The woman before her seemed a shadow of the confident emergency room nurse who had raised her single-handedly after Dad's death 12 years ago. Ellen had always been their family's cornerstone, working double shifts to put Rebecca through private school, never missing a parent-teacher conference or piano recital. "You're not alone in this," Rebecca said, moving closer. "Whatever it is, we can figure it out together." Ellen's shoulders tensed. "I have a meeting to get to." She grabbed her purse and keys, avoiding her daughter's concerned gaze. "Don't wait up for dinner." "A meeting?" "It's Sunday evening, Mom. The hospital's not dash." "It's a support group," Ellen cut in, too quickly. "For grief. I should have gone years ago, after your father." The lie hung between them like smoke. Rebecca had checked, there were no grief support groups meeting in their area on Sunday evenings. She'd been monitoring her mother's movements for weeks now, noting the pattern of mysterious departures, always at odd hours, always with that same tight smile and rehearsed excuse. As the front door closed behind Ellen, Rebecca pulled out her phone and opened the tracking app she'd installed during her last visit home. A red dot began moving across the map, heading not toward the hospital or any community center, but toward the industrial district on the city's edge. The rain intensified outside, drumming against the roof. Rebecca's fingers hovered over the emergency contact for Professor James Chen, her criminal law mentor. He'd offered to help when she'd first shared her concerns about Ellen's behavior, but she'd hesitated, afraid of what she might discover. A text notification lit up her screen, an alert from her bank app. The scholarship funds that had been deposited last week had vanished, transferred to an unknown account. Rebecca's heart clenched as she realized the transfer authorization had come from her mother's phone. The red dot on the tracking app stopped moving, settling over an abandoned warehouse complex. Rebecca grabbed her car keys, her mind racing through everything she'd learned about organized crime and money laundering in her law classes. The scholarship money was just the latest withdrawal in a pattern she'd been too afraid to acknowledge. As she stepped into the rain, Rebecca remembered her mother's words from years ago, spoken over her father's fresh grave: "Sometimes love means protecting people from the truth." Now, watching the rain wash away her footprints, Rebecca wondered who was protecting whom, and at what cost. She started her car, the engine's hum mixing with the storm's fury. Whatever her mother had gotten involved in, whatever darkness had crept into their lives, Rebecca would find a way to bring her back into the light. Even if it meant stepping into the shadows herself. The warehouse loomed before Rebecca, its weathered walls gleaming in the rain. She killed her headlights and parked behind an abandoned delivery truck, her hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel. Through the rain-streaked windshield, she could make out her mother's silver Honda in the distance, parked beside a black SUV with tinted windows. Memories flooded back, Ellen teaching her to always trust her instincts, to recognize when something felt wrong. Everything about this place screamed danger, from the broken security cameras to the fresh tire tracks cutting through old puddles. Rebecca pulled out her phone, thumb hovering over Professor Chen's number again, but stopped short. One wrong move could put her mother in even greater danger. A flash of movement caught her eye. Two men in expensive suits emerged from a side door, flanking Ellen as she walked between them. Even from this distance, Rebecca could see the rigid set of her mother's shoulders, the careful way she kept her head down. Not submission, survival. The same posture she'd adopted in the months after Rebecca's father died, when the medical bills and funeral costs had nearly broken them. Rebecca slipped out of her car, the rain masking her footsteps as she crept closer. Pressed against the cold brick wall, she could hear voices carrying through a partially opened window. "The interest is non-negotiable, Ellen." A man's voice, smooth as silk but lined with steel. "Mr. Kingston was very clear about the terms when you first came to us." "I've already paid back twice the original amount," Ellen's voice shook slightly. "My daughter's scholarship money, that was supposed to be the final payment." A sharp laugh cut through the air. "The final payment? Oh, Ellen. You're far too valuable to let go. Your position at the hospital, your access to certain restricted substances. Mr. Kingston considers you an investment." Rebecca's blood ran cold. The pieces clicked into place, the mysterious late-night phone calls, the extra shifts that never appeared on Ellen's pay stubs, the times she'd come home with haunted eyes and shaking hands. Her mother wasn't just in debt to criminals, she'd become their unwilling accomplice. "I won't help you smuggle any more drugs," Ellen's voice hardened. "Find someone else to falsify the inventory records." The sound of flesh meeting flesh echoed through the window, followed by a muffled cry. Rebecca bit back a scream, her nails digging crescents into her palms. "Your daughter's quite the promising law student, isn't she?" The man's voice dripped with menace. "It would be a shame if something happened to compromise her future. A drug charge, perhaps? Or evidence of her involvement in a theft ring? Leave her out of this." The tremor in Ellen's voice was gone, replaced by something harder, darker. "I'm warning you." Laughter again, multiple voices this time. "You're warning us. Think carefully, Ellen. Your next move determines whether Rebecca graduates with honors or in handcuffs." Rebecca's phone buzzed in her pocket, a text from Professor Chen. "Where are you? Tracked your phone location. Police contact standing by. Don't do anything rash." Through the window, she could see her mother's face in profile, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights. A thin trail of blood traced down from her split lip, but her eyes blazed with a fierce protectiveness that Rebecca recognized from childhood, the look that promised nothing and no one would ever harm her daughter. The truth hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Every sacrifice, every compromise, every dark bargain her mother had struck, it had all been for her. The weight of that love, twisted by desperation into something dangerous but no less pure, threatened to bring her to her knees. Thunder rolled overhead as Rebecca backed away from the window, her mind racing. She had evidence now, names, locations, the scholarship money transfer that could be traced. But evidence meant exposure, and exposure meant danger. Her legal training screamed at her to document everything, to build a case methodically and carefully. Her heart screamed to grab her mother and run. As she slipped back to her car, Rebecca caught a glimpse of movement in the warehouse's upper windows, more men in suits, some carrying what looked suspiciously like weapon cases. This wasn't just about debt anymore. Her mother had stumbled into something much darker, and the deeper she went, the harder it would be to pull her out. The rain washed away her tears as Rebecca started her car, mind already forming the beginnings of a plan. She was her mother's daughter after all, willing to do whatever it took to protect the ones she loved. But she had something Ellen didn't: the law, her training, and allies who could help them fight this the right way. First, though, she had to convince her mother to trust her with the whole truth, before Kingston's organization decided they were both too much of a liability to keep alive. Dawn found Rebecca sitting at her childhood desk, surrounded by scattered papers and empty coffee cups. She hadn't slept, couldn't sleep, not after what she'd witnessed. The gentle tick of her father's old wall clock seemed to mock the urgency burning through her veins. Ellen lay sleeping in the next room, or pretending to sleep. The split in her lip had swollen, a visceral reminder of the previous night's revelations. Rebecca had waited up for her return, heart pounding with each passing hour, until her mother had finally slipped through the door at 3 a.m. Their eyes had met in the dim hallway, and for a moment, Rebecca had seen past her mother's carefully constructed walls to the terror beneath. "We need to talk," Rebecca had whispered. Ellen had simply shaken her head, pressing trembling fingers to her injured lip. "Not now. Please." But "not now" was no longer an option. Rebecca turned to her laptop, where Professor Chen's email glowed on the screen. He'd sent her information about witness protection programs, immunity deals, the legal framework for prosecuting organized crime. But between the lines of legal jargon lay an unspoken warning: every path forward carried its own dangers. A soft knock at her door made Rebecca start. Ellen stood in the doorway, wrapped in the faded blue robe Rebecca's father had given her on their last anniversary together. In the pale morning light, she looked both stronger and more vulnerable than Rebecca had ever seen her. "You followed me last night," Ellen said. "Not a question." Rebecca nodded, watching her mother's face carefully. "How long has this been going on?" Ellen moved into the room slowly, picking up a framed photo from Rebecca's desk, the three of them at the beach, years ago, before cancer had taken her father. Before the medical bills had started piling up. Before desperate choices had seemed like the only choices. It started small. Ellen's voice was barely above a whisper. "Mr. Kingston approached me at the hospital. Said he'd heard about our situation, about the debts. Offered to help." She set the photo down with trembling hands. "The interest rates were impossible, but I was drowning. Then he started asking for favors. Small things at first, information about certain patients, access to restricted areas. By the time I realized what I'd gotten into." "Why didn't you tell me?" Rebecca fought to keep the hurt from her voice. "We could have faced this together." Ellen's laugh was hollow. "Tell you what? That your mother had become a criminal. That everything we had, your education, this house, our life, was built on lies." She sank onto Rebecca's bed, shoulders curved inward. "I wanted to protect you. By sacrificing yourself." Rebecca moved to sit beside her mother, taking her hand. "Mom, I saw those men last night. Heard what they said. This isn't just about debt anymore, is it? They own me," Ellen whispered, and the words seemed to drain the last of her strength. "The things they've made me do, if it ever came out, I'd lose my nursing license. Go to prison. And now they're threatening you." Rebecca squeezed her mother's hand, feeling the familiar calluses from years of hospital work. "Tell me everything. No more secrets." And finally, the walls crumbled. Ellen spoke of late-night deliveries disguised as medical supplies, of falsified records and diverted medications. Of Kingston's growing demands and the web of blackmail that kept her trapped. Of other hospital staff who'd been drawn in, some willing, others coerced like her. With each revelation, her voice grew stronger, as if the truth itself was a form of liberation. Rebecca listened, her legal training cataloging evidence even as her heart ached. When Ellen finally fell silent, the morning sun had filled the room, casting their shadows long across the floor. "There's a way out," Rebecca said carefully. "But you have to trust me completely. And it's going to be hard, harder than anything we've done before." Ellen looked at her daughter, really looked at her, perhaps seeing for the first time not the child she'd sought to protect but the woman who'd grown strong enough to protect them both. "Whatever it costs," she said, "it can't be worse than living like this." Rebecca pulled out her phone, pulling up Professor Chen's contact. We'll need help. People we can trust. And Mom? She waited until Ellen met her gaze. What they did to you, what they made you do, that's on them, not you. We're going to make this right. Ellen's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. When did you become so strong? I learned from you, Rebecca said softly. The real you. Not the version they tried to create. As she dialed Professor Chen's number, Rebecca felt the weight of their shared history, of love twisted by circumstance but never broken. The road ahead would be treacherous, but they would walk it together, step by careful step, toward whatever light they could find. The hospital corridor stretched before Ellen like a gauntlet. Every squeaking shoe, every beeping monitor, every shadow in her peripheral vision sent ripples of anxiety through her body. But she kept her head high, her steps measured, her nurse's smile perfectly in place. She'd learned long ago that visibility could be its own kind of armor. 3 days had passed since her confession to Rebecca. 3 days of careful planning, of quiet documentation, of Professor Chen's steady guidance through the legal maze ahead of them. 3 days of living with both hope and terror, knowing that each shift at the hospital could be the one where Kingston's people decided she'd become too much of a liability. Ellen. The voice behind her made her freeze. Dr. Marcus Kingston Jr., the son of her tormentor, stood at the nurse's station. His smile was a perfect mirror of his father's, all charm on the surface, ice underneath. A word in private? She followed him to an empty consultation room, her heart thundering against her ribs. Through the window, she could see the late afternoon sun painting the parking lot in shades of amber and shadow. Somewhere out there, Rebecca waited in her car, ready with a camera and a recording device, documenting every entrance and exit, every suspicious interaction. Dad's concerned about your commitment to our arrangement, Marcus said, closing the door with deliberate care. Especially after your little outburst the other night. He thought you might need a reminder of what's at stake. He placed a manila envelope on the desk between them. Ellen's hands trembled as she opened it, spreading out photographs that made her blood run cold. Rebecca entering her law school. Rebecca at her favorite coffee shop. Rebecca in Professor Chen's office. Such a promising future, Marcus mused, tracing a finger across one of the photos. Would be a shame if the Board of Ethics received evidence of her involvement in a prescription drug ring. Or if certain substances were found in her apartment. Ellen's voice emerged stronger than she felt. You leave her out of this. That's entirely up to you. Marcus leaned closer, his cologne cloying in the small space. Tonight. Midnight. The usual place. Dad has a special delivery that needs your personal attention. As he turned to leave, Ellen caught a glimpse of something in his eyes, not just cruelty, but fear. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The Kingstons were scared. Something had spooked them enough to escalate their threats. The moment Marcus left, Ellen pulled out her phone with shaking hands, sending a prearranged signal to Rebecca. 3 heart emojis, their code for immediate danger. Within seconds, her daughter replied with a simple "okay" followed by a butterfly. Professor Chen was being notified. Ellen sank into a chair, the photographs scattered around her like fallen leaves. Each image of Rebecca felt like an accusation, a reminder of how her attempts to protect her daughter had only put her in greater danger. But beneath the guilt and fear, something else stirred, a fierce, protective rage that had been building for years. The consultation room door opened again, and Ellen tensed until she recognized Sarah, a fellow nurse who'd started around the same time she had. Sarah's eyes went immediately to the photographs, then to Ellen's face. They threatened my son too, when I first tried to get out, Sarah said quietly, closing the door behind her. That's how they work. They find our weak points and press until we break. Ellen stared at her colleague, seeing for the first time the same haunted look she faced in her own mirror. How many of us are there? More than they know. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "We've been waiting, watching, gathering evidence. Some of us thought you might be one of us, but we had to be sure." She slipped Ellen a piece of paper with a series of numbers. "When you're ready, call. You and Rebecca aren't alone." The paper felt warm in Ellen's hand, like a lifeline thrown into deep water. She thought of Rebecca waiting outside, of Professor Chen building their case piece by piece, and now this, an underground network of others who'd been caught in the Kingston's web. As Sarah left, Ellen gathered the photographs with steady hands, tucking them carefully into her scrub's pocket. Each image of Rebecca was a reminder not just of their vulnerability, but of their strength. The Kingstons saw her daughter as leverage, a pressure point to exploit. They didn't understand that love could be a weapon too, that the bonds they tried to use against them could become the very thing that brought them down. The sun had set by the time Ellen finished her shift, casting long shadows through the hospital corridors. In the parking lot, Rebecca's car idled in their predetermined spot, a beacon in the gathering dark. As Ellen walked toward it, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, coordinates for tonight's delivery, a reminder of the noose around her neck. But for the first time in years, Ellen felt something beyond fear. She had her daughter's strength, Professor Chen's guidance, and now the knowledge that others stood ready to help. The midnight meeting loomed ahead, but it wouldn't go the way the Kingstons planned. Because this time, Ellen wasn't walking into darkness alone. Professor Chen's office felt like a sanctuary as Rebecca spread out the evidence they'd gathered across his desk. The late evening light filtered through Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across photographs, financial records, and carefully documented testimony from Sarah and 3 other nurses who'd come forward. "Your mother's testimony will be crucial," Chen said quietly, studying Ellen's written statement. His weathered face carried the weight of decades defending those who'd been trapped in impossible situations. "But Kingston's organization has friends in high places. We need to be absolutely certain before we move." Rebecca touched the edge of a photograph showing her mother entering the warehouse. "She's getting ready to meet them tonight. Let me wear a wire, get direct evidence dash." "No." Ellen's voice cut through the room. She stood in the doorway, still in her hospital scrubs, her face pale but determined. "I won't risk you that way. Mom dash. Listen to me, both of you." Ellen moved into the room, her steps carrying a new purpose. "I've spent years protecting you from this darkness, Rebecca. Trying to shield you from my mistakes. But I see now that my silence only gave them more power." She placed her hands flat on the desk, studying the evidence of her own exploitation. "Tonight has to end differently." Professor Chen leaned forward. "Ellen, if you're planning something dash." "They're scared," Ellen interrupted. "I saw it in Marcus's eyes today. They're making mistakes, getting sloppy with their threats. Sarah told me they've been moving larger shipments, taking bigger risks. They're preparing for something big, and they need me there tonight to help cover their tracks." Rebecca felt her chest tighten. "Which means it's the perfect opportunity to catch them, but also the most dangerous moment." She reached for her mother's hand, finding it steady and warm. "We do this together or not at all." Ellen's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained strong. "When your father was dying, he made me promise to keep you safe. I thought that meant shielding you from every hard truth, every painful reality. But watching you these past few days, your strength, your determination to fight for what's right." She squeezed Rebecca's hand. "You've become everything he hoped you would be." Professor Chen cleared his throat. "I have a contact in the FBI's Organized Crime Division. She's been building a case against the Kingstons for months. Your evidence, combined with the testimony from the other nurses, could be the key to bringing down their entire operation. But we have to move carefully," Rebecca added, her legal training kicking in. "One wrong step and they could destroy everything, the evidence, the witnesses, our credibility." Ellen pulled out her phone, showing them the message with tonight's coordinates. Then we make every step count. She looked at her daughter, really looked at her, seeing not just the child she protected but the woman who now stood ready to protect her. I spent years letting fear guide my choices. Tonight, I choose differently. The next hour was a blur of careful planning, of FBI agents speaking in hushed tones, of wiretaps and tracking devices being prepared. Through it all, Rebecca watched her mother's face, seeing the subtle transformation as years of shame and fear gave way to quiet determination. As the sun set, casting long shadows through the office windows, Ellen pulled Rebecca aside. "Whatever happens tonight," she whispered, "know that everything I did, every compromise, every dark moment, it was all for love. A twisted kind of love, maybe, but the only way I knew how to show it." Rebecca wrapped her arms around her mother, breathing in the familiar scent of hospital antiseptic and the lavender lotion she'd used since Rebecca was small. "Love doesn't have to hurt like this anymore, Mom. We're finding a better way." Ellen pulled back, cupping her daughter's face in her hands. "You've become so wise." She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Your father would be so proud." "I know I am." As they prepared to leave the office, Rebecca caught Professor Chen watching them with a mix of concern and admiration. He'd seen countless stories of justice and injustice play out over his career, but something about their story had touched him deeply. "Remember," he said softly, "strength isn't about never being afraid. It's about moving forward despite the fear." Ellen straightened her shoulders, every inch the fierce protector she'd always been, but now with a new purpose. "Fear kept me silent for years. Tonight, the truth speaks." The setting sun painted the sky in shades of purple and gold as mother and daughter walked out together, their shadows merging into one. Ahead lay darkness and danger, but also the promise of dawn. They'd face it as they should have faced everything, together, drawing strength from the very bonds their enemies had tried to use against them. The warehouse air hung heavy with tension as Ellen walked through its shadowed corridors, her footsteps echoing against concrete. Each step carried the weight of years of fear, of silent compromises, of love twisted by desperation into something that had nearly destroyed them both. But beneath her surgical mask, Ellen wore a small smile. Because this time, she wasn't alone. Hidden surveillance teams tracked her movement, their presence unseen but felt like a protective embrace. Rebecca waited safely outside with Professor Chen, surrounded by FBI agents ready to move. Most importantly, Sarah and the other nurses had come forward, their combined testimony forming an unbreakable chain of evidence. Kingston stood in the center of the main storage area, surrounded by boxes marked as medical supplies. His son Marcus lurked in the shadows, phone in hand, watching Ellen's approach with predatory focus. Right on time, Kingston's voice carried its usual silk-wrapped steel. "I trust you're ready to be more cooperative than our last meeting." Ellen removed her mask slowly, deliberately. Her split lip had healed, but the memory of that night burned bright. "Actually," she said, her voice steady, "I'm here to negotiate new terms." Kingston's laugh echoed off the walls. "Negotiate? My dear, I don't think you understand your position." "I understand perfectly." Ellen moved closer, each step measured and sure. "I understand that the DEA is investigating shipment discrepancies at 3 hospitals. That your son's medical license is under review. That Sarah and the others have already given their statements to the FBI." The change in Kingston's expression was subtle but profound. Behind him, Marcus took an involuntary step forward, his phone dropping to his side. "You're bluffing," Marcus spat, but his voice trembled. Ellen pulled out her own phone, showing them the screen. A group chat revealed dozens of nurses sharing their stories, their evidence, their determination to break free. "We're not afraid anymore," she said softly. "And we're not alone." Kingston's facade cracked. "You stupid woman. Do you think your daughter's career can survive what I'll do to her? One phone call, and dash. And what? Rebecca's voice rang out as she stepped from the shadows, Professor Chen and FBI agents flooding in behind her. "You'll add witness intimidation to the charges?" Ellen's heart clenched at the sight of her daughter, but pride overwhelmed fear. Rebecca stood tall, her law student badge still pinned to her blazer, a symbol of the justice they'd fought so hard to preserve. What followed happened in flashes: Kingston lunging for a hidden gun, FBI agents moving with practiced precision, Marcus trying to flee only to run straight into Sarah and 3 other nurses waiting at the exit. Through it all, Ellen remained still, watching years of oppression crumble under the weight of truth finally spoken. Later, as dawn broke over the city, Ellen and Rebecca sat together on their front porch, steam rising from cups of properly brewed coffee. The morning paper lay between them, its headline announcing the Kingston family's arrest and the uncovering of a multi-state drug trafficking operation. "I keep thinking about all the times I almost told you," Ellen said softly, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of hope. "All the moments I chose silence, thinking it would keep you safe." Rebecca leaned against her mother's shoulder, their bodies fitting together like they had when she was small. "You taught me something important, though. About love. Real love." "What's that?" "That it's not just about protection. It's about trust. About believing in each other's strength." Rebecca took her mother's hand, feeling the familiar calluses earned through years of healing others. "You tried to carry everything alone, but in the end, we were strongest together." Ellen squeezed her daughter's hand, tears falling freely now. "Your father would be so proud of you. Of us. He'd be proud of you too, Mom. For finding your way back to yourself. For choosing to fight instead of hide." Inside the house, their phones buzzed with messages from Sarah and the other survivors, checking in, offering support, sharing small victories. A community born from shared pain had blossomed into something healing and whole. "What happens now?" Ellen asked, watching the neighborhood come alive with morning routines, school buses, and the simple miracle of ordinary days. Rebecca smiled, the same determined smile she'd inherited from her mother. "Now we heal. We tell our story. We help others find their voice." She paused, adding, "And we never forget that love, real love, is stronger than any shadow." The morning light grew stronger, chasing away the last traces of darkness. Ellen looked at her daughter, seeing not just the child she tried to protect, but the woman who had helped her find redemption. Together, they had transformed a legacy of fear into one of courage, proving that sometimes the greatest act of love is not sacrifice, but the bravery to begin again. As neighbors waved and cars passed by, mother and daughter sat in companionable silence, their coffee growing cold, their hearts growing stronger. The road ahead would have its challenges, but they would face them as they had faced everything else, together, drawing strength from the unbreakable bond between them, and the profound truth that healing begins when we dare to hope for something better.